And then you guys were on your way back from just my office where is it your husband or your boyfriend?
My husband.
Your husband? How long you guys been married?
A year and a half.
A patrol car rolls into a scene that should not exist. A vehicle stopped in a live roadway at a yield sign, not pulled off, not hazard parked with intention, simply left there as if the driver's decision-making shut down mid-sentence. The first seconds establish the central danger without needing any dramatic framing. A roadway is not a bedroom, and a running car is not a neutral object. The problem is not just that someone has fallen asleep. The problem is that an entire chain of risks has already been accepted as normal. Risk to the driver, risk to any passing motorist, risk to the officers now forced to manage an unstable situation in the dark. The approach is cautious because it has to be. A stationary car can still be a moving weapon when the transmission is engaged. The initial focus is not on conversation. It is on control. The officers see a person who is not responsive in the way a tired person should be responsive. The details that follow make the case for impairment before anyone says the word. The driver is difficult to wake. The vehicle is in drive. That single fact changes the temperature of the entire encounter. A foot shifts, a body slumps, a knee twitches, and the car can surge forward. Even if the driver never intended harm, intent is irrelevant to physics. As they work to rouse him, the officer's observations begin to stack. The driver's eyelids and facial responsiveness do not match ordinary fatigue. The body looks present but inaccessible, like the mind is delayed behind the eyes. In these moments, police behavior is often judged later as either professionalism or aggression. Here, it reads as urgency shaped by safety rather than ego. A driver in drive is a liability. An unresponsive driver in drive is a hazard with a countdown timer. The officers are not trying to win an argument. They are trying to prevent a preventable catastrophe. Their attention drifts briefly into the cabin, and the scene gains a second layer. What appears in the center area is not treated as proof. It is treated as context. The suggestion of drug paraphernalia, pipe-like items, foil, does not conclude anything by itself, but it changes how the officers interpret what they are seeing in the driver's behavior. Impairment is no longer only alcohol, no longer only exhaustion. It becomes a broader impairment investigation, and that is where roadside encounters often begin to mutate. Once multiple impairment theories exist, officers tend to widen their control measures to protect themselves from surprises. That widening is not always abusive, but it always increases the citizen's loss of autonomy. When the driver finally becomes responsive enough to speak, the first exchange is not a narrative. It is a scramble. The driver's words come with confusion and delay, and the officers repeatedly have to re-anchor the conversation. Names, basic orientation, a coherent reason for being there. These are not just administrative details. They are functional tests of cognition. The officers do not need an emotional outburst to identify a problem. They need consistent, timely comprehension. The driver's condition forces the officers to treat simple conversation like a diagnostic instrument. The central claim emerges. He was tired. It is the most benign explanation available, and it arrives with the simplicity of an excuse that hopes to end the situation rather than explain it. Too tired is not impossible. It is also incomplete. Being tired does not place a car in drive at a yield sign in the middle of the road. Being tired does not explain the earlier struggle to wake. Being tired can contribute to bad judgment, but the encounter is now beyond judgment. It is about whether this person can safely operate a vehicle at this moment. The officers pursue that threshold not because they need to punish fatigue, but because allowing the driver to continue would be a decision with measurable public consequences. The next phase is subtle control disguised as cooperation. The officer asks the driver to step out, undo the seatbelt, walk back, keep hands visible. The tone stays polite, even conversational, but the structure is unmistakable. The driver is being moved into a controlled space where observation is easier and risk is lower. The instruction about hands is not performative. It is a risk management ritual embedded into modern policing. Every repetition of hands out of pockets signals the same institutional truth. Officers are trained to assume the unknown is dangerous until proven otherwise. That assumption is not personal, but it becomes personal in the lived experience of the citizen. Once outside the vehicle, the officer begins to assemble a picture through targeted questions: drinking, drugs, where he is heading, why he stopped there. The driver denies alcohol and drug use, and the denial is confident in a way that does not match the earlier unresponsiveness. That mismatch matters. One of the most consistent tells in impairment cases is not slurred speech or stumbling. It is the gap between the driver's self-assessment and the observable reality. A person who is genuinely just tired tends to acknowledge it with embarrassment and relief. A person who is impaired often clings to denial as a strategy, not because they are malicious, but because impairment itself distorts self-awareness. The investigation tightens around the visible items inside the cabin. The officer references the pipe, and the driver provides an admission that undercuts his earlier blanket denial. The pipe is for marijuana. This single pivot exposes how quickly a driver's story can shift when confronted with physical context. The officer follows that thread carefully. Whether he smoked tonight, whether containers in the back are alcohol-related, whether those items are old. The driver insists the pipe exists, but claims no recent use, and the containers are old. The narrative becomes a patchwork of partial admissions and timing arguments, a common pattern in roadside encounters where the citizen tries to concede harmless facts while denying present impairment. At this point, the officer does something that often separates a solid investigation from a sloppy one. He seeks verification through standardized testing, not because tests are perfect, they are not, but because they provide a structured way to justify the next legal step. This is where reasonable suspicion evolves. The initial basis is a car stopped in the road, the driver initially unresponsive, the vehicle in drive, and indications of paraphernalia. That cluster supports further investigation. Field sobriety tests become the bridge from suspicion to probable cause. Officers who skip that bridge often create legal vulnerability later. Officers who overuse it can turn routine encounters into coercive theater. The balance is procedural and psychological at the same time. The testing begins with the eyes. The officer explains positions, instructions, lighting, irritation, medical issues. This is not filler, it is foundation. A careful officer tries to preempt later claims that the test was unfair or that medical conditions explain poor performance. The controlled calm of the instructions also serves another purpose. It forces the driver to demonstrate sustained attention. Impairment is frequently visible in attention failures, more than in balance failures. Following a moving point, holding still, processing instructions. These are quiet stressors that expose cognitive delay. The sequence continues into the walk and turn. Again, the officer explains the test in detail before initiating it, placing the driver in a starting position and demanding stillness while instructions are delivered. This structure is intentional. It tests listening and working memory. A sober person can hold the instruction set. An impaired person tends to move early, forget steps, or compensate with improvisation. Even without quoting the driver, the transcript's flow shows an officer building an evidentiary record by method. Explain, confirm understanding, observe, repeat as needed. It is clinical, in the way traffic enforcement becomes clinical when the outcome might be an arrest. The one-leg stand follows, with the same pattern of explanation and timekeeping. The driver counts. The officer corrects height and monitors. This is where the encounter becomes less about the driver's story and more about the driver's body. The tests convert the abstract claim, "I am fine," into observable performance. In the background, the driver's earlier denial remains on the table, and the officer is now measuring the distance between denial and reality. Then comes the moment the entire encounter has been moving toward the preliminary breath test. A breath test is not just a number, it is a power transfer. Before the breath test, the driver can negotiate with language. After the breath test, language loses leverage. The officer shows a clean reading first, establishing that the machine is not already contaminated by prior samples. This is another procedural detail that becomes decisive later. It signals an officer who anticipates scrutiny, who understands that the legitimacy of the process matters as much as the result. The driver's demeanor shifts into a kind of resigned cooperation. There is no dramatic resistance, no escalation into shouting. Instead, the driver's own admission about being over the limit appears before the device confirms it. That admission is critical because it reveals internal awareness that contradicts earlier denials. It suggests that the denial was strategic rather than sincere, an attempt to survive the first phase of police contact by minimizing risk. In many cases, that strategy is driven by panic, not calculation. People deny reflexively because admitting feels like self-destruction, even when the evidence is already forming around them. When the device produces its result, the encounter becomes irreversible. The number is well above the legal limit. It is not borderline. It is not the kind of reading that invites a warning or a ride home. It is the kind of reading that transforms the earlier scene, sleeping at a yield sign in drive, into an obvious outcome of impairment rather than fatigue. The earlier puzzle pieces snap into place. The unresponsiveness, the confusion, the risky parking, the slow comprehension. The officer no longer needs to interpret those behaviors as ambiguous. The reading pulls them into a single coherent narrative. Impaired driving that progressed into unconsciousness or near unconsciousness while the car remained capable of movement. The arrest follows, and the officer frames it as a conclusion based on observations and testing, not as a personal judgment. That framing matters. In bodycam footage, arrests often look like decisions made out of irritation. Here, it reads like a procedural inevitability. The driver accepts it with minimal protest, requesting personal items from the vehicle. Even this moment contains an unspoken irony. The driver speaks of cookies and a phone with a casualness that clashes with the severity of what just happened. It is not comedy. It is the human brain trying to normalize trauma by focusing on small comforts. Handcuffs are applied, and the officer checks for fit and pain. This is another subtle indicator of professionalism. Officers who intend to dominate often ignore comfort. Officers who intend to process tend to confirm welfare, not out of kindness alone, but because unnecessary pain creates unnecessary complications. The driver's response is compliant, even oddly affirming, describing the cuffs as tolerable. The encounter settles into the administrative cadence of an OI arrest, securing property, considering towing, planning transport, and transitioning from roadside investigation to paperwork. Yet the deeper story has already been told. A person placed themselves and others at risk, and the system caught them at the moment the risk became visible. The footage shows how quickly just tired collapses under structured observation. It also shows something more uncomfortable. How impairment investigations can remain calm and polite while still stripping a person of control. The driver's autonomy dissolves, not through shouting, but through method. A few safety commands, a few standardized tests, a number on a screen, a pair of cuffs. The most revealing tension is not between officer and driver. It is between the driver's initial narrative and the reality that emerges step by step. The driver tries to keep the encounter in the realm of explanation. The officers pull it into the realm of verification. That difference, story versus evidence, is where authority truly shifts. The driver's words become irrelevant, not because the officers refuse to listen, but because the process produces a truth that language can no longer negotiate away. The arrest does not end the encounter. It changes its legal atmosphere. On the roadside, the officers were operating in an investigative space driven by safety and suspicion. Once cuffs click, the situation becomes custodial, and custody is not merely a physical condition. It is a constitutional threshold. The driver is no longer a person being evaluated for fitness to drive. He is now an arrestee whose words can become evidence in a different category, interpreted through a harsher lens. The camera keeps rolling, and what follows is where many Bodycam cases quietly reveal their most consequential details. Not the dramatic stop, not the test, not even the number on the device, but the procedural decisions that determine whether the rest of the process is clean or contaminated. The tone remains calm, almost friendly, and that calm can be deceptive. Calm can signal professionalism, but it can also mask the expansion of police authority into areas the citizen does not fully understand. The driver, now restrained, is asked about personal comfort and the mechanics of what happens next. The officers mention avoiding towing costs if a sober person can retrieve the vehicle. This appears considerate, and it likely is, but it also preserves the department's operational efficiency. A vehicle stopped in the road at a yield sign is already a problem. Leaving it there longer is unacceptable. The towing decision is practical, and offering an alternative is a way to close the scene without unnecessary friction. The driver asks for a chance to call someone. The officers allow the idea but control the timing, postponing access to the phone until the paperwork phase. In an idealized view of policing, this is simply organization. Secure the scene, then handle calls. In a more critical view, It demonstrates how custody reorganizes a person's agency. The driver's needs are not refused, but they are subordinated to procedure. The road belongs to the state. The process belongs to the state. Time itself belongs to the state, parceled out at the officer's discretion. This is one of the most powerful realities of arrest that people rarely anticipate until they experience it. Compliance does not buy autonomy. It only buys smoother processing. As the officers manage the driver's placement in the back of the squad car, the language shifts into a workflow. We're going to do this, then that. The driver is guided to the passenger side and seated. The camera captures a strange, almost surreal normalcy. Handcuffs described as comfortable, politeness exchanged, gratitude offered. It is easy for viewers to interpret this as a benign arrest. But the absence of overt aggression does not mean the stakes are low. It means the system is functioning without resistance. The less resistance there is, the more quietly authority consolidates itself. Then comes a pivotal internal conversation between officers, brief, casual, operational, that reveals how policing often treats roadside findings as opportunities. The officers discuss the pipe, the potential to get the driver to admit what it is for, and the intent to search the car. This is not unusual. It is a routine mindset. An OE arrest opens doors. In many jurisdictions and under many policies, officers can search incident to arrest, conduct inventory searches connected to towing, and seek consent to search. Each of these pathways has different legal boundaries and justifications. And the crucial difference is that consent is voluntary in theory, but in custody it becomes complicated in practice. A restrained person, seated in a police car surrounded by armed authority, is rarely in a psychological state to make free, unpressured choices, even when they say yes. The officer recognizes that a line has been crossed into custodial interrogation territory. He references the fact that because the driver is in custody, rights need to be read before asking investigative questions. That recognition is significant. It indicates an awareness of legal process rather than improvisation. The Miranda warning is delivered in the familiar cadence. The right to remain silent. Statements used in court. Right to an attorney appointed if indigent. Right to stop questioning at any time. The driver indicates understanding. On paper, this is the moment the system claims legitimacy. The state tells you the rules, you acknowledge them, and then the conversation continues. But what happens next exposes a common psychological trap. The driver attempts to invoke the right to silence, saying he will plead the fifth, then immediately backtracks. This is one of the most revealing micro moments in the entire encounter. The driver understands, at least intellectually, that silence is protective. Yet the pressure to appear cooperative overrides that protection. The backtrack is not a confession. It is a capitulation to the social demand embedded in policing. Answer me and we'll get through this. Even when officers are polite, the structure communicates that cooperation is rewarded and resistance is punished, if only through inconvenience or escalation. Once the driver retracts, the officer moves into questioning about the pipe. The driver tries to rehabilitate the earlier marijuana admission by reframing it. Not marijuana, but Delta 8, described as federally legal and not THC-based. This is an attempt to create a legal shield around a visible object. It's also an attempt to reduce the moral weight of the item, to make it seem like a harmless technicality. The officer does not debate chemistry. He maintains control by keeping the questions focused and forward-moving. The purpose of questioning at this stage is not education. It is documentation. Every answer becomes a rung in a ladder that can support further action. The questioning widens to the containers in the back seat. Bottle, can, previously dismissed as old. Here the system's logic is straightforward. Open intoxicants can be separate violations, and they also color the narrative of impairment. A driver already arrested for OWI who also has open alcohol in the vehicle becomes a more robust case. The officer asks whether the driver is okay with them going into the vehicle to search the back area and ensure there are no drugs or additional alcohol. The driver agrees. That agreement, captured on camera, becomes the department's cleanest pathway into the car. Consent. But consent in custody is a complicated moral artifact. The driver has already been arrested. He has already produced a high breath reading. He has already lost control. The choice is largely symbolic. Saying no could feel like inviting retaliation, even if no retaliation occurs. Saying yes feels like compliance, and compliance feels like safety. This is how consent functions in many police encounters, less a free choice, more a coping mechanism. It is a psychological exchange, cooperation for perceived leniency, whether or not leniency is actually on offer. The officers enter the vehicle and begin to locate items. The footage shifts from the driver's body to the driver's environment, and here the earlier denials fully collapse under physical reality. A cold bottle is discovered, something not consistent with the claim that it has been there for a while. The officer notes its temperature and cost with almost conversational surprise, as if the object itself is speaking. This is not just evidence of an open intoxicant, it is evidence of recentness. Cold implies recent acquisition, recent storage, recent presence. It undermines the narrative that the vehicle's alcohol traces are old remnants. It suggests the driver's earlier minimization was not an innocent misunderstanding, but an effort to manage consequences. This is where small decisions compound into serious outcomes. The driver's first decision was to drive while impaired. The second was to stop in an active roadway. The third was to deny impairment when questioned. The fourth was to partially admit and partially minimize. The fifth was to retract a brief attempt at silence. The sixth was to consent to a search that uncovered evidence contradicting his minimization. Each step narrows the space for mercy and widens the justification for enforcement. None of this requires officers to shout or threaten. The system operates like a funnel. Every choice feeds into the next narrowing. It is also where institutional dynamics become visible. Police work is not only about catching someone, it is about building a case that survives court scrutiny. The officer's behavior here reflects that aim. They read rights before questioning. They secure consent on camera. They narrate observations. They document. This is the state constructing a story that can be retold later in paperwork, hearings, and courtroom testimony. The Bodycam is not merely a recording device. It is a witness that never forgets, and officers increasingly speak for it. Every okay and thank you from the driver becomes a reinforcing note of compliance, a protective layer for the department against accusations of coercion. Yet the system's smoothness does not erase the underlying imbalance. The driver's intoxication is not only a personal failure, it is a societal hazard. And the officer's actions are not purely punitive. They are corrective in a public safety sense. But the same system that prevents a potential crash also creates opportunities for broader enforcement, drug-related suspicions, open container charges, vehicle searches, some of which may be justified, some of which may be opportunistic, and all of which are enabled by the inherent vulnerability of a person in custody. By the time the charges are articulated, OWI and open intoxicants, the encounter has fully transitioned from roadside intervention to legal consequence. The camera's final beats show a process that, on the surface, appears orderly. The driver is not assaulted. He is not taunted. He is processed. And that distinction is important because many viewer reactions rely on visible brutality to identify misuse of authority. But misuse can also be quiet. The subtle leveraging of custody to obtain consent, the conversational steering that draws admissions, the institutional habit of treating every stop as a gateway to additional enforcement. In this case, the strongest critique is not that the officers manufactured a crime. The breath result is decisive, and the roadway stop was inherently dangerous. The critique is more structural. How the power of the state expands after arrest, how quickly a driver's rights become theoretical when social pressure and procedural control are layered over them, and how an individual, confused, impaired, and trying to appear cooperative, can accidentally help the state strengthen the case against him. And the footage also reveals a different kind of accountability lesson. Bodycam does not only capture misconduct, it captures competence. The officers demonstrate a methodical approach that keeps the encounter from spiraling. Their calm, their step-by-step instruction, their attention to safety details, vehicle and drive, hands visible, controlled movement, suggest training and discipline. At the same time, the driver's experience illustrates why civil liberties conversations matter even in clean arrests. The law provides protections, but psychology determines whether people can use them. The right to remain silent is only as strong as a person's ability to withstand the pressure to be agreeable. The encounter has become a complete cycle. Danger detected, impairment verified, custody imposed, evidence expanded, charges reinforced. The system has done what it is designed to do. The question left hanging is not whether the driver should have been arrested. He should have been. The deeper question is how the same mechanisms that protect the public can also normalize a kind of procedural dominance that few people fully understand until the door shuts and the paperwork begins. By the time the final charges are articulated, the encounter has lost any remaining ambiguity. What began as a welfare check and traffic safety intervention has matured into a fully documented criminal case. The driver is no longer the central actor in his own story. He has become the subject of it. The officers, meanwhile, have shifted completely into institutional mode. Their language, their movements, even their pauses now serve one purpose: closing the loop in a way that is administratively defensible, legally resilient, and procedurally complete. This is the least dramatic phase of bodycam footage, and often the most revealing. There is no adrenaline left, no uncertainty about what must be done. Instead, there is a quiet efficiency that reflects how frequently this process is repeated. For the driver, this is likely a singular destabilizing event. For the officers, it is a familiar pattern unfolding exactly as expected. That asymmetry is at the heart of modern policing. The system is built to absorb individual crises without being affected by them, while individuals are reshaped, sometimes permanently, by even a single encounter with the system. The charges themselves are straightforward. Operating while intoxicated is supported by observation, standardized testing, and a breath reading well above the legal limit. Open intoxicants in the vehicle are supported by the discovery of alcohol that contradicts the driver's earlier claims. There is no reliance on interpretation or subjective judgment at this stage. The evidence is physical, numerical, and documented. This matters because it demonstrates how authority becomes unassailable once it is supported by process. Even if the driver were to contest aspects of the stop or the interaction, the core facts would remain difficult to challenge. What is striking, however, is how little the driver resists once the outcome is clear. There is no protest, no attempt to argue legality, no escalation into confrontation. Instead, there is acceptance, even gratitude. And this is not an endorsement of the situation. It is a coping response. When people realize that resistance will not change the outcome, many default to compliance as a way to preserve dignity. The driver's politeness should not be misread as consent to what has happened. It is simply the behavior of someone trying to endure a moment they can no longer control. The officers, for their part, continue to manage the driver's comfort and logistics. They check handcuffs. They explain next steps. They offer small courtesies within the boundaries of custody. This is often interpreted by viewers as kindness, and in a limited sense it is. But it is also functional. A compliant detainee is easier to transport, easier to process, and less likely to generate complaints. Professionalism and self-interest align neatly here, and that alignment is what makes this phase appear so calm. The Miranda warning delivered earlier now takes on its full weight. The driver was informed of his rights, acknowledged understanding them, and then chose to speak anyway. From an institutional perspective, this is ideal. It shields the department from claims of coercion. From a human perspective, it highlights how fragile rights can be under pressure. The driver's brief attempt to invoke silence followed by retraction is not uncommon. Many people interpret the right to remain silent as something to be used selectively rather than absolutely. They believe they can answer safe questions and avoid dangerous ones. In reality, once questioning resumes, the distinction collapses. Every answer becomes part of a mosaic that prosecutors can later assemble. And the search of the vehicle, conducted with the driver's consent, completes that mosaic. The discovery of cold alcohol does more than add a charge. It retroactively reframes the entire interaction. It casts the driver's earlier statements in a different light, transforming them from possible misunderstandings into apparent misrepresentations. This shift is subtle, but powerful. Courts and juries are far less sympathetic to defendants whose statements are contradicted by physical evidence. Credibility erodes quickly once dishonesty, intentional or not, enters the narrative. This is where the system's compounding effect becomes most visible. Each stage of the encounter increases the stakes of the next. The initial denial of impairment invites testing. The testing invites a breath sample. The breath result invites arrest. The arrest invites questioning and search. The search invites additional charges. None of these steps are inherently abusive, but together they form a ratchet mechanism. Once engaged, it rarely reverses. The driver's fate is not determined by a single mistake, but by the accumulation of them, each narrowing the range of possible outcomes. From a broader accountability perspective, the footage demonstrates both the strengths and the blind spots of Bodycam-era policing. On one hand, the presence of a camera appears to reinforce procedural correctness. Officers explain tests, read rights, seek consent, and narrate findings. These behaviors suggest an awareness that actions will be reviewed later by supervisors, attorneys, or the public. On the other hand, the camera does not capture internal pressure, training biases, or institutional incentives. It shows what happens, not why it happens the way it does. The why is embedded in policy and culture. Officers are trained to treat impaired driving as a high-risk offense because it is. They are also trained to leverage lawful opportunities to uncover additional violations, because doing so strengthens cases and reinforces deterrence. These priorities are not inherently malicious, but they create an environment where enforcement naturally expands once a stop is justified. The driver's experience illustrates how quickly one suspected violation can cascade into multiple consequences, some of which may feel disproportionate from the perspective of the person being arrested. It is also worth noting what does not happen. There is no use of force beyond handcuffing. There is no verbal abuse. There is no obvious overreach that would dominate headlines or trigger internal affairs investigations. This absence is important because it underscores a reality often missed in public debates. Most controversial policing outcomes do not arise from extreme misconduct. They arise from ordinary procedures applied to vulnerable people in moments of crisis. The system does not need to be cruel to be overwhelming. It only needs to be consistent. As the officers finalize the scene and transition fully into post-arrest processing, the driver's role becomes almost passive. He is informed, moved, seated, and told what will happen next. His future, court dates, potential penalties, financial costs, and personal consequences now exists outside the frame. The body cam does not follow him into those outcomes, but they are implicit in every administrative step taken. An OWI charge carries weight far beyond the roadside. It affects licenses, employment, insurance, and personal reputation. None of that is visible in the footage, yet all of it is set in motion here. The footage ends not with a dramatic conclusion, but with closure. Charges are summarized. The situation is resolved from the officer's perspective. This ending mirrors how the justice system often presents itself, orderly, rational, and complete. But for the person arrested, closure is an illusion. What feels like an ending to the officers is the beginning of a long process for the driver. Court appearances, legal fees, potential sanctions, and the enduring memory of a night where control slipped away. The deeper lesson of this encounter lies in its normalcy. There is no villain in the traditional sense. The officers act within policy. The driver breaks the law. Public safety is served by removing an impaired driver from the road. And yet, the footage still raises uncomfortable questions about power, autonomy, and the lived experience of enforcement. It shows how quickly authority consolidates once impairment is suspected, how difficult it is for individuals to exercise rights under pressure, and how easily cooperation can be mistaken for consent. It also highlights a paradox at the heart of law enforcement accountability. Bodycam footage is often demanded as a safeguard against abuse, and rightly so. But when footage shows a clean arrest, it can lull viewers into believing that the system is always fair when it is calm. Calmness, however, is not the same as fairness. It is possible for an encounter to be both lawful and deeply disempowering. It is possible for rights to be read and still function poorly in practice. And it is possible for officers to act professionally while still benefiting from structural advantages that leave citizens at a severe disadvantage. In the end, this case does not hinge on whether the driver deserved to be arrested. The evidence makes that clear. It hinges on understanding how the system operates when everything goes according to plan. There is no scandal here, no explosive misconduct. There is only a reminder of how thin the line is between everyday life and the machinery of the state. One moment, a person is driving home. The next, they are sitting in the back of a squad car, their future reframed by numbers, procedures, and policies they did not design and cannot control. That is the quiet power of this footage. It does not shock, it instructs. It shows how authority is exercised not through force but through process, not through intimidation but through inevitability. And it leaves the viewer with a sobering realization. In encounters like this, the most consequential shifts often occur not when voices rise, but when procedures click smoothly into place, one after another, until there is no room left to turn.